In August 2025, the numbers told a story that no handshake or parade could disguise. Chinese exports to Russia fell by more than 16%. Russian sales to China dropped nearly 18%. For two powers that once declared their partnership had no limits, the sudden downturn is more than a hiccup. It signals strain, hesitation, and a partnership under pressure. Outwardly, Xi and Putin still walk side by side. But behind the cameras, the trust that once held this relationship together is beginning to fray. That marked the fifth consecutive month of falling exports. And up to August, China's exports to Russia over the year had slipped some 8.8%, while imports from Russia declined by around 8.2%, putting total bilateral trade at approximately 1.03 trillion yuan, approximately 145 billion US dollars, for the first 8 months. Russian shipments to China had reversed a modest rise witnessed in July. Thus, what was once a momentum-driven expansion now shows definite signs of contraction. Those numbers raise a stark question. How did a relationship described as a strategic lifeline turn so fragile so fast? The backdrop helps explain. Following Russia's full-scale invasion of Ukraine in 2022, Moscow faced sweeping Western sanctions. Europe reduced its energy imports, and many of Russia's supply chains were cut off by U.S. export restrictions and banking blockades. China quickly stepped in as Russia's economic backstop, purchasing raw materials, delivering goods, equipment, and technology, and assisting Russia in adjusting to a more closed global market. In 2023 and 2024, there were numerous reports of record highs in bilateral commerce. However, Beijing seems to be readjusting the amount of help it is prepared to provide, in spite of the collaborative picture ops and public promises. According to the data, China may have already satisfied a large portion of its realistic demand for Russian energy and filled its strategic reserves. Indeed, in August 2025, China's crude oil imports from Russia dropped by 15.2% by volume, year on year, while the overall crude import levels remained largely stable thanks to increased purchases from elsewhere. That suggests Russia's export capacity is running into diminishing returns with its major partner. Further pressure comes from the tightening web of Western sanctions. Under the Trump administration, the United States has expanded secondary sanctions to penalize foreign firms that facilitate trade with sanctioned Russian entities, including Chinese banks, tech firms, and manufacturers. Any assistance to Russia's defense, high-end tech, or finance sectors risks harsh retaliation or disconnection from the broader Western financial system. Beijing, already wary of U.S. pressure, cannot afford a misstep, especially in 2025, when China's own economic circumstances are strained. Youth unemployment is on the rise, growth is faltering, and the real estate market is struggling. This severely limits Beijing's readiness to provide Moscow with unrestricted support. Chinese banks have tightened compliance on transactions associated with Russia in recent months, and Chinese infrastructure projects backed by Russia have been covertly renegotiated or delayed. Defense and technology joint initiatives are being reduced. Cooperation between advanced semiconductors, artificial intelligence, and communications has slowed or stopped. Some Chinese companies have canceled delivery entirely or redirected it through third parties. Analysts refer to the phenomenon as quiet decoupling, despite the fact that these actions are not publicly recognized. Meanwhile, the United States and its allies are turning up the pressure. In September 2025, G7 finance ministers pledged to target entities increasing Russian oil purchases or helping Russia evade sanctions. The U.S. has floated imposing steep tariffs or secondary sanctions against firms that enable Russia's war machine, even those based in China. In parallel, the European Union and key states like Germany and France are tightening export controls on advanced technologies and considering coordinated sanctions policies with Washington. The shrinking market options pose a particular risk to Russia. The so-called pivot to the east, which was once hailed as a means of escaping Western isolation, is now in decline. India, Russia's erstwhile energy lifeline, is now retreating, and China is adjusting its conditions. Data shows that between May and August 2025, India's purchases of Russian oil decreased by over 30% from the previous year, while spot shipment volumes almost halved. Even heavily discounted Russian oil is becoming less appealing, according to analysts, due to the possibility of secondary sanctions, more scrutiny by insurers and financial institutions, and a changing geopolitical alignment. As a result, Russia is more alone than before. It now relies more and more on a small group of purchasers, all of whom are more potent and circumspect than Moscow may have expected. In fact, in August 2025, China alone accounted for 47% of Russia's crude exports, while India made up 38%. Together, they dominate Russia's fossil fuel revenue stream. But if either pulls back further, Russia has limited fallback options. Yet the pivot is not total collapse. Both governments maintain official links and high-level diplomatic meetings, and China continues to be Russia's largest energy consumer and important commercial partner. Red carpets were spread, strategic concord was highlighted by state media, and new pipeline projects, such as Power of Siberia 2, were reaffirmed in principle during Putin's September 2025 visit to Beijing for a military parade and conference, while pricing and operating parameters are still up in the air. Russian authorities attribute the weakening to Beijing's willingness to slow down, the market overstock of Chinese goods, and sanctions. Nevertheless, self-interest is being used to rebalance that harmony. China is establishing limits, assistance is still provided, but it is no longer unconditional. This change is more than just symbolic for Russia. It undermines Moscow's core assumption that Beijing would always remain a reliable economic anchor. Instead, China is making clear that it will help only when it aligns with Chinese priorities and where the risks are manageable. This deeper recalibration has centuries of precedent. Russia and China, even during periods of ideological alliance, have long competed for influence in Central Asia and beyond. The current trade surge is not so much a marriage of equals as a relationship rooted in imbalance. Russia sells raw materials and imports China's manufactured goods, and increasingly, technology. China does, however, have leverage at scale. Beijing is much more equipped to adjust the cooperation if Moscow's backing ever threatened the underpinnings of China's development or its reputation internationally. The geopolitical landscape is changing in the meantime. Through the Belt and Road Initiative, China is extending its influence throughout Central Asia, a region that was once firmly under Moscow's control. Moscow may still have military might, but its economic clout is eroding. Beijing avoids giving Russia deadly assistance in its war in Ukraine, despite the Kremlin's assertions of their no-limits partnership, as it grows more wary of becoming embroiled in a battle with the West. On the other hand, nations with fewer international connections, such as North Korea, lack this restriction and freely provide Moscow with weapons. Ultimately, what we are witnessing is not the end of China-Russia relations, but a redefinition. The optics of unity will persist, but China is clearly setting guardrails. The deeper message is that in 2025, China is less a rescuer and more a cautious partner. And for Russia, that change is far more perilous than any decline in trade figures. Because when your most trusted backer begins stepping back, what remains is vulnerability. In global power plays, alliances shift, not just through war and treaties, but through supply, trade, and risk. China's recalibration may not be loud, but it is unmistakable. And Russia, for the first time in years, might have to face its isolation head-on.